January 17, 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with humidity so thick it felt solid against the skin. In a foxhole carved from red volcanic earth, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Hayashi Takeshi pressed his back against mud walls that wept moisture like open wounds. The air tasted of rotting vegetation and cordite. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the coconut palms, American voices called out, not shouting, not panicking, just talking, casual as men discussing the weather. Hayashi's hands trembled as he gripped his Arisaka rifle. He had been trained since boyhood to believe in the invincibility of Japanese spirit, in the righteousness of the Emperor's divine mission, in the certainty that no foreign soldier could match the discipline and warrior heritage of the Imperial Japanese Army. But 3 weeks facing the United States Marines had taught him a different lesson entirely. A lesson written in blood and terror and something worse than death, the sickening realization that everything he had been told was a lie. 40 yards away, through vegetation so dense it seemed woven from shadows, Marine Corporal James Mitchell from Tennessee cleaned his M1 Garand with methodical precision. He had been awake for 26 hours. His utilities were stiff with dried sweat and mud, but his hands were steady. He had eaten that morning, not well, but he had eaten. There were cigarettes in his pocket. His rifle had ammunition. And most importantly, he knew with absolute certainty that somewhere behind him, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean, was a nation capable of producing everything he needed to win this war: food, bullets, bandages, replacements, ships, planes, tanks, an endless conveyor belt of material superiority that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could overcome. Mitchell didn't hate the Japanese soldier hiding in the darkness ahead. He pitied him. Because Mitchell understood something that Hayashi was only beginning to grasp. This war was already over. The Japanese just didn't know it yet. The hatred Japanese soldiers developed for facing United States Marines was not born from a single battle or campaign. It emerged gradually, brutally, across the blood-soaked islands of the Pacific, a psychological transformation as significant as any tactical development of the war. To understand this visceral animosity, this fear that bordered on existential dread, one must first understand what Japanese soldiers expected to encounter when they went to war against America, and how catastrophically those expectations collided with reality. The Japanese military of 1941 was built upon a warrior tradition stretching back centuries. The samurai code of Bushido permeated every level of training and indoctrination. Young men were taught from childhood that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor achievable. Surrender was not merely forbidden, it was literally unthinkable, a stain upon family honor worse than any death. Japanese soldiers trained with brutal intensity. Physical hardship was embraced as character building. Meager rations were standard. Brutal discipline from superiors was accepted as necessary. The entire military culture was designed to create men who could endure anything, who would never yield, who would fight to the last breath with whatever weapons remained. This warrior ethos was reinforced by propaganda that painted Americans as soft, decadent, pleasure-seeking people incapable of sustained sacrifice. Japanese military intelligence provided detailed analyses suggesting American soldiers would crumble when faced with determined opposition. The Americans loved comfort too much. They were mongrels, mixed races without the purity and cohesion of the Japanese. They were materialistic consumers who worshipped money rather than honor. How could such people possibly stand against warriors who embraced death? Japanese commanders genuinely believed their soldiers, trained in deprivation and willing to die without hesitation, would prove tactically superior despite American material advantages. The early months of the Pacific War seemed to confirm these assumptions spectacularly. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. Wake Island fell, Guam fell, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, fortress after fortress, collapsed before the Imperial Japanese advance. American, British, Dutch, and Australian forces retreated in disarray. The carrier strike on Pearl Harbor had crippled American naval power. The sinking of the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse demonstrated Japanese aerial superiority. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the mid-Pacific, from the Aleutians to the approaches of Australia. Japanese soldiers could be forgiven for believing what their commanders told them, that American fighting spirit was inferior, that decisive Japanese will would overcome American material advantages. Then came Guadalcanal. The island itself was unremarkable, a malarial jungle rock in the Solomon chain that few Japanese planners had considered strategically important until American forces landed there in August 1942. The Japanese response was confident, almost casual. A modest force would drive the Americans back into the sea. Japanese soldiers had never lost a land campaign. Certainly these soft Americans would break and run when faced with true warriors willing to die. But the men who came ashore at Guadalcanal were not the garrison troops who had surrendered at Corregidor. They were not Filipino scouts or British colonial forces. They were United States Marines, specifically the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift. And over the next 6 months, these Marines would systematically destroy every assumption Japanese soldiers held about American fighting capabilities. The first shock came during the initial Japanese counterattacks. Japanese commanders, confident in the superiority of night combat tactics and bayonet charges, launched waves of infantry against Marine positions around the captured airfield. The piece of terrain Americans had already named Henderson Field. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive assault, spirit over firepower. The bayonet charge, executed with fanatical courage, would overwhelm enemy positions before superior American artillery could respond effectively. The reality was slaughter on an industrial scale. Marines dug into defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, waited with cold professionalism as Japanese infantry charged across open ground. American artillery, heavier, more numerous, and directed by forward observers with radios, dropped curtains of high-explosive shells with devastating accuracy. Marine riflemen, armed with M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as the trigger could be pulled, poured fire into charging Japanese formations with a volume unimaginable to troops still using bolt-action rifles. Browning automatic rifles added sustained firepower. Machine gun crews with water-cooled .30-caliber weapons laid down grazing fire that transformed Japanese assault waves into sprawling fields of corpses. A Japanese officer's diary recovered after the Battle of the Tenaru River recorded the shock in stark terms. The enemy's weapons fire without ceasing. Our men fall like rice stalks before the harvest. The Americans do not break. They do not retreat. They stand in their positions and kill us with terrible efficiency. This is not what we were told to expect. That diary entry captured a psychological turning point. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to believe that their willingness to die would overcome American material superiority. But facing Marines taught them a horrifying truth. Americans were perfectly willing to kill them efficiently and without emotion, and American firepower made Japanese courage irrelevant. Bravery could not stop artillery shells. Fighting spirit could not deflect machine gun bullets. Dying gloriously for the Emperor accomplished nothing when American defensive positions simply killed every man in the charge and then waited calmly for the next wave. The second shock was the physical endurance of the Marines themselves. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft city dwellers who required constant comfort. But the Marines at Guadalcanal endured conditions that rivaled anything Japanese soldiers experienced. They fought in the same malarial jungles. They endured the same tropical heat, the same torrential rains, the same humidity that rotted clothing and turned minor cuts into infected wounds. They went on half rations when supply lines were threatened. They slept in mud. They fought while sick with malaria and dysentery, and they never broke. What Japanese soldiers could not understand, what violated their entire worldview, was that Marines endured these hardships not because they were conditioned to accept suffering as spiritually purifying, but because they understood the suffering was temporary and purpose-driven. Marines knew that American supply ships would eventually arrive. They knew that American factories were producing medicine, food, ammunition, and replacements. They knew that their nation's industrial capacity was geared toward supporting them. This knowledge created a fundamentally different psychology. Japanese soldiers endured hardship because they had no choice and believed suffering was virtuous. Marines endured hardship because they understood it was a tactical situation, not a permanent condition, and that American logistics would eventually prevail. The third shock, perhaps most devastating to Japanese morale, was the sheer abundance of American material. When Marines captured Japanese positions, they found soldiers equipped with minimal supplies, surviving on handfuls of rice, often operating with insufficient ammunition. When Japanese forces overran Marine positions, increasingly rare as the campaign progressed, they discovered a wealth that seemed impossible. American soldiers had canned food, real coffee, cigarettes, medical supplies in abundance, clean bandages, morphine for the wounded, and weapons, so many weapons, with ammunition measured not in carefully rationed rounds, but in cases and crates. A Japanese intelligence report from late 1942 noted with barely concealed desperation, "The American soldier carries more equipment into battle than our soldiers possess in base camps. Their wounded receive medical care that exceeds what is available to our senior officers. They waste ammunition on suppressive fire that would supply an entire Japanese company. This is not an army. This is an industrial process wearing the uniform of war." That phrase, an industrial process, captured something essential about why Japanese soldiers came to hate and fear Marines above all other opponents. Fighting Marines was not like fighting other armies. It was like fighting a machine that never tired, never ran out of supplies, and never stopped improving. Every engagement taught Americans lessons that were rapidly incorporated into doctrine and training. Mistakes that cost lives in August were corrected by September. Equipment failures reported in October were addressed with modified or replaced gear by November. The American military establishment treated war as a problem to be solved through systematic analysis, industrial production, and continuous improvement. Japanese military culture, by contrast, treated war as a test of spiritual purity. When tactics failed, commanders demanded more fighting spirit. When equipment proved inadequate, soldiers were told to overcome material deficiency through willpower. The idea of systematically analyzing failure and adapting accordingly was foreign to a military culture that viewed admission of tactical error as shameful. Japanese commanders who failed were expected to commit ritual suicide, not write after-action reports recommending doctrinal changes. This fundamental philosophical difference created an exponentially widening capability gap. Marines learned and adapted. Japanese forces repeated the same tactics with increasingly desperate courage and increasingly catastrophic casualties. Night attacks that failed in August were tried again in September with the same results. Bayonet charges that produced only Japanese corpses were ordered again and again because the alternative, admitting that Japanese tactics were fundamentally flawed, was psychologically impossible for commanders steeped in Bushido tradition. The hatred Japanese soldiers felt toward Marines was thus compounded by humiliation. It was not merely that Marines were winning, it was that they were winning in ways that invalidated every aspect of Japanese military culture. Japanese soldiers were trained to accept any hardship. Marines endured the same hardships without viewing suffering as virtuous. Japanese soldiers were trained to fight to the death. Marines fought intelligently, preserving their lives while killing efficiently, understanding that a live soldier who could continue fighting was more valuable than a glorious death. Japanese soldiers were trained to overcome material disadvantage through superior will. Marines had both superior material and equal determination. The psychological impact on Japanese survivors was profound. Prisoners, rare because Japanese soldiers typically chose death over capture, spoke of Marines with a mixture of hatred, fear, and grudging respect that bordered on superstitious dread. Marines, they reported, did not act like normal soldiers. They did not panic under fire. They did not break when overrun. They fought hand to hand with savage ferocity when necessary. They showed no mercy to wounded Japanese soldiers, having learned early that Japanese troops often feigned death to kill unwary Americans. And they were supported by material abundance that seemed limitless. One captured Japanese diary from the Guadalcanal campaign recorded a telling observation. The American Marines throw away more food than we receive in rations. They fire more bullets in a single engagement than my entire company was issued for the month. Their wounded are evacuated by air. Ours are left to die because there is no medicine and no transportation. How can we win this war? How can spirit overcome such material superiority? Our officers tell us to fight harder, but we are already fighting to the death. What more can be asked? That question, what more can be asked, haunted Japanese forces throughout the Pacific War. Because the answer, within the framework of Japanese military culture, was nothing. Soldiers were already giving everything. They were already dying by the thousands. They were already demonstrating courage that would have been considered legendary in any other context. But against Marines backed by American industrial might, Japanese courage was simply fuel feeding a fire that could not be extinguished. The campaigns that followed Guadalcanal only reinforced and amplified Japanese hatred for facing Marines. Tarawa, in November 1943, demonstrated that even when Japanese forces held ideal defensive terrain, a fortified atoll with overlapping fields of fire, concrete bunkers, artillery support, and troops commanded to die in place, Marines would take the position through sheer determination and firepower. The Japanese garrison of nearly 5,000 men fought almost to the last soldier. Fewer than 150 allowed themselves to be captured, most of them wounded and unconscious. But the Marines took Tarawa in 3 days. 3 days to overrun positions that Japanese commanders had boasted would take the Americans months to capture, if they could capture them at all. The butcher's bill was high, over 1,000 Marines killed, nearly 2,500 wounded. American newspapers called it a bloodbath. But to Japanese military planners, Tarawa's lessons were even more horrifying than Guadalcanal's. Even when every tactical advantage favored the defense, even when Japanese soldiers fought with suicidal determination from prepared positions, Marines would attack directly into killing zones and continue attacking until the position fell. No amount of Japanese courage could overcome that combination of determination and material superiority. Saipan and Tinian in 1944 added new dimensions to Japanese fear of Marines. These were not isolated jungle islands. They were populated territories considered part of the Japanese homeland itself. Japanese civilians lived there alongside military garrisons. The defense was conducted with desperate intensity, knowing that loss of the Marianas would bring American B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. Japanese soldiers were told in the starkest terms that defeat was unacceptable, that every man must kill 10 Americans before dying, that families and emperor depended on their sacrifice. The Marines who landed on Saipan outnumbered the Japanese garrison, but they faced terrain heavily favored for defense. Rugged highlands, caves, ravines, every geographic feature fortified and manned by troops prepared to die. Japanese commanders launched desperate counterattacks. Thousands of soldiers participated in one of the largest banzai charges of the war, a human wave attack designed to overwhelm American positions through sheer mass and fanatical courage. Marines dug in with artillery support and naval gunfire available on call, destroyed the attack almost completely. When the smoke cleared, nearly 4,000 Japanese dead lay sprawled across the battlefield. American casualties in the same engagement numbered in the hundreds, still terrible, still mourned, but mathematically demonstrating the fundamental imbalance in combat effectiveness. A Japanese officer's final radio message, before committing suicide, captured the despair. "We die here as ordered, but our deaths accomplish nothing. The Americans simply step over our bodies and continue advancing. They have endless replacements, endless ammunition, endless artillery support. We kill some, but for every American that falls, 2 more take his place. This is not war as we understood it. This is extermination conducted with industrial efficiency. I die for the Emperor, but I die knowing our sacrifice is meaningless against such overwhelming force." That message, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, was never shared with the Japanese public. But it circulated among Japanese military staff officers as a kind of forbidden truth, an admission that the official narrative of spiritual superiority enabling tactical victory was demonstrably false. Japanese soldiers could fight with superhuman courage. They could endure hardships that would break most armies. They could demonstrate tactical skill and individual bravery. And none of it mattered when facing Marines supported by the full industrial might of the United States. The campaign on Peleliu in September 1944 revealed another dimension of Marine effectiveness that Japanese soldiers found particularly demoralizing: adaptability. Japanese defenders on Peleliu abandoned the banzai charge tactics that had proven so catastrophically ineffective. Instead, they created a defense in depth, using the island's coral caves and ridges to construct mutually supporting positions that maximized American casualties while preserving Japanese forces. The plan was to make the Americans pay so dearly for every yard of ground that the will to continue would erode. The Marines adapted faster than Japanese planners anticipated. When frontal assault proved too costly, Marines used flamethrowers and demolitions to clear caves. They called in airstrikes with devastating precision. They brought up tanks and used point-blank fire to destroy fortified positions. They employed combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, air support, and naval gunfire into a seamless whole. When direct assault was too costly, they bypassed strong points and isolated them, cutting off supplies and leaving defenders to either die slowly or attempt breakouts that American firepower would destroy. Japanese defenders on Peleliu fought with the expected determination. The garrison of over 10,000 men lost all but a few hundred soldiers over nearly 3 months of combat. But they lost. And the manner of losing was perhaps more demoralizing than quick defeat would have been. Japanese soldiers watched as their carefully prepared positions were systematically reduced. They watched as American logistics ensured Marines never ran short of ammunition or supplies. They watched as wounded Marines were evacuated quickly, while Japanese wounded died slowly for lack of medical care. They watched as the industrial machine they were supposed to defeat, through superior spirit, simply ground their positions to dust through overwhelming application of firepower and methodical tactical adaptation. A document recovered after the war, written by a Japanese lieutenant who survived Peleliu, one of the few, recorded observations that military historians later recognized as remarkably clear-eyed analysis. The American Marines are not supermen. As individuals, they are no braver than our soldiers. But they are trained to think, not merely to obey. When their officers are killed, junior leaders immediately take command without confusion. When tactics fail, they try different approaches instead of repeating the same attack. They are supported by communications that allow them to call artillery or air support within minutes. They are part of a system, and the system is far more powerful than any individual soldier, no matter how brave. We cannot defeat this system through courage alone. We needed equal material support and equal tactical flexibility. We had neither. That lieutenant's analysis was quietly suppressed by Japanese military censors, but it represented a truth that ordinary Japanese soldiers had already internalized through brutal experience. Facing Marines was qualitatively different from facing other Allied forces. British, Australian, and Chinese armies could be fought and sometimes beaten through superior Japanese determination and night attack tactics. But Marines combined material superiority with tactical proficiency and individual determination that matched or exceeded Japanese warrior spirit. Worse, Marines improved constantly, learning from every engagement, while Japanese forces repeated the same tactics because their military culture could not admit that Bushido spirit was insufficient. The hatred Japanese soldiers felt toward Marines was thus layered and complex. There was the straightforward hatred of an effective enemy who killed efficiently. There was the frustrated hatred born from applying maximum effort and achieving nothing. There was the humiliated hatred of seeing one's entire military culture and training revealed as inadequate. And underneath it all was a deeper, more existential dread, the growing awareness that Japan could not win this war, that American material superiority would eventually grind Japanese resistance to nothing, and that every sacrifice, every death, every demonstration of courage was ultimately pointless against an enemy that could simply produce more supplies, more weapons, more men than Japan could ever match. This psychological reality was reflected in Japanese military communications that American codebreakers intercepted throughout 1944 and 1945. Japanese commanders used increasingly desperate language when referring to Marine units. They were not merely called enemies, but described as if they were forces of nature, implacable, unstoppable, inhuman in their effectiveness. Orders to units facing Marine landings carried a tone of fatalism, absent from orders to face other Allied forces. Japanese soldiers were told to sell their lives dearly, not because victory was possible, but because death in place was the only honorable option remaining. By the time Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, Japanese defenders knew with absolute certainty that they were going to die. The island's commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, told his garrison explicitly that no reinforcements would arrive, no evacuation was possible, and their mission was simply to kill as many Americans as possible before being killed themselves. The entire defense was designed around making Marines pay the maximum price in blood for every yard of volcanic ash. For 36 days, Japanese soldiers carried out that mission with the desperate courage of men who knew they were already dead. They fought from deep bunkers connected by tunnels, emerging to ambush Marines and then vanishing underground before supporting fire could destroy them. They positioned artillery in caves impervious to naval bombardment. They created killing zones where American tanks and infantry would be channeled into prepared fields of fire. They fought with the skill and determination that had always characterized Japanese forces. And it was not enough. Marines took Iwo Jima through systematic application of combined arms tactics and overwhelming firepower. When underground positions could not be reached with conventional weapons, Marines used flamethrowers and demolitions to create hell on earth inside tunnel systems. When Japanese artillery remained hidden in caves, Marines called in naval gunfire from battleships until the rock itself shattered. When Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels behind American lines, Marines dealt with them through small unit tactics that emphasized mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. The battle was costly, nearly 7,000 Marines killed, over 19,000 wounded, but it was never in doubt. Japanese courage and tactical skill delayed American victory, but could not prevent it. The Japanese garrison of over 20,000 soldiers was annihilated. Only 216 prisoners were taken, most of them wounded and unconscious. The rest fought until killed or committed suicide. And when the island fell, American B-29s gained an emergency landing field that would save thousands of American aircrewmen over the remaining months of the war, a strategic victory that mathematically justified the battle's horrific casualties, though that calculation offered little comfort to Marines who fought in Iwo Jima's volcanic ash and left friends buried there. Okinawa, the final great land battle of the Pacific War, represented the culmination of Japanese hatred and fear of facing Marines. The island was Japanese home territory, last land barrier before invasion of Japan itself, and defended by over 100,000 Japanese troops with explicit orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying. The defense was sophisticated, abandoning beachhead defense in favor of fortifications in depth across rugged terrain, ideal for defense. Japanese commanders knew they could not win. The objective was simply to make American victory so costly that terms short of unconditional surrender might be negotiated. The battle lasted 82 days, from April through June 1945. Marines, now joined by Army divisions in the largest Pacific campaign, faced the most determined Japanese resistance of the entire war. Defensive positions were engineered with skill learned from years of defeat. Artillery was precisely registered on likely American avenues of approach. Counterattacks were timed to maximize casualties. Kamikaze aircraft targeted American naval support with suicidal determination. The Japanese defense of Okinawa represented the finest tactical performance Japanese forces achieved in the Pacific War. And still, they lost, comprehensively and completely. American forces, combining Marine and Army divisions with overwhelming air and naval support, destroyed the Japanese garrison almost entirely. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died. Fewer than 10,000 surrendered, many of them Okinawan civilians conscripted into military service rather than professional soldiers. Japanese tactics that in 1942 might have created operational difficulties for American forces were by 1945 simply obstacles to be overcome through systematic application of firepower and tactical proficiency refined through years of hard combat experience. The ratio of casualties told a stark story. American forces suffered approximately 50,000 casualties, including 12,000 dead, terrible numbers that shocked the American public and influenced post-war strategic calculations. But Japanese forces were annihilated. The exchange ratio, while closer than earlier campaigns due to improved Japanese tactics and ideal defensive terrain, still demonstrated fundamental imbalance. Americans could replace casualties. Japan could not. Americans could sustain this level of combat indefinitely. Japan could not. Marines fighting on Okinawa knew that every yard of ground taken brought them closer to victory. Japanese soldiers knew that every yard lost brought their nation closer to destruction. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before planned invasions of Kyushu and Honshu could begin, but Japanese military planners had already calculated the mathematics of those invasions with horrifying clarity. Plans called for mobilizing the entire civilian population for homeland defense. Every man, woman, and older child would be armed with bamboo spears or improvised weapons and instructed to attack American invaders. The strategy was not designed to win, but to make American victory so costly that negotiated peace might be possible. Underlying this desperate plan was the knowledge, shared by every Japanese soldier who had faced Marines in combat, that conventional defense would fail. American material superiority combined with Marine tactical proficiency would overcome any defense that Japanese forces could construct. The hatred Japanese soldiers felt toward Marines was ultimately the hatred of men who had given everything, courage, endurance, loyalty, life itself, and discovered that everything was not enough. It was the psychological devastation of seeing one's entire belief system invalidated by reality. Japanese military culture taught that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Marines proved that belief catastrophically wrong. Japanese training emphasized that willingness to die would ensure victory. Marines demonstrated that staying alive while killing efficiently was tactically superior to glorious death. Japanese propaganda claimed Americans were soft and decadent. Marines endured conditions equal to anything Japanese soldiers faced, then went home when the war ended, rather than treating suffering as spiritually purifying. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and former soldiers wrote memoirs, a recurring theme emerged. Marines were remembered differently than other American forces. Army units were described as competent, well-equipped, tactically sound. Marines were described in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or demonic forces. They were implacable, unstoppable, seemingly immune to hardship or fear. Individual Marines were no supermen, Japanese veterans acknowledged, but collectively, supported by American logistics and continuously refined tactics, Marines functioned as a weapon system that Japanese forces had no effective counter for. This perception contained truth, but also distortion born from trauma. Marines were extraordinarily effective, rigorously trained, and superbly supported. But they were human. They felt fear. They made mistakes. They suffered in the Pacific's brutal conditions. What made them so effective and so hated by Japanese opponents was not superhuman ability, but systematic competence, backed by overwhelming material support. Marines represented the industrial might of the United States, translated into military effectiveness. Every Marine who landed on a Pacific island was backed by factories producing weapons, farms growing food, shipyards building transports, medical facilities, training corpsmen, training centers, producing replacements. The individual Marine was the tip of a spear forged from America's entire industrial and agricultural capacity. Japanese soldiers understood this by the end. The hatred they felt toward Marines was ultimately hatred of their own powerlessness against American productive capacity. No amount of courage could overcome that advantage. No degree of willingness to die could balance that equation. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate gallantry throughout the Pacific War, demonstrated courage that would have ensured victory in any previous conflict, and lost anyway because courage cannot manufacture ammunition, cannot create supplies, cannot replace ships or aircraft destroyed faster than they can be built. The symbolic objects that represented American abundance to Japanese soldiers were painfully simple: canned food, cigarettes, clean bandages, morphine for the wounded. These were not luxury items, but basic supplies that American logistics provided routinely, while Japanese soldiers often went without. A recovered Japanese diary from Saipan described stumbling into an abandoned Marine position and finding cases of rations, boxes of ammunition, and medical supplies left behind because they were too bulky to carry forward. The diary's author noted with bitter irony that the Americans discarded more supplies in routine operations than his entire company had received in a month. That single observation captured the futility of fighting Marines more powerfully than any tactical analysis could. The transformation of Japanese perception from confident warriors, certain of racial and spiritual superiority, to desperate defenders who knew they were fighting inevitable defeat occurred over 3 years of sustained combat across the Pacific. Guadalcanal began the education. Tarawa demonstrated that even ideal defensive terrain could not save them. Saipan showed that homeland territory would be taken regardless of sacrifice. Paleliu proved that improved tactics only delayed defeat. Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that maximum Japanese effort would be ground down through systematic American attrition. Each battle taught the same lesson. Marines backed by American industrial might could not be stopped by any force Japan could deploy. The epilogue of this story was written not in battle, but in occupation. When American forces arrived in Japan after surrender, many Japanese civilians expected brutal treatment. Their government had told them Americans were barbarians who would rape and murder. But the Americans who came ashore, many of them the same Marines who had fought so savagely across the Pacific, behaved with discipline and even compassion. They brought food for starving civilians. They provided medical care. They oversaw rebuilding efforts. They treated defeated enemies with humanity that Japanese military culture had never taught Japanese soldiers to extend. This final reversal completed the ideological destruction of Japanese military culture. The Marines who had fought so effectively were not superhuman warriors animated by hatred. They were professionals doing a difficult job, capable of savage efficiency in combat and remarkable restraint in peace. They could kill efficiently when necessary and show mercy when possible. This balance, fighting effectively without losing one's humanity, was perhaps the most alien concept to Japanese military culture, which taught that effective fighting required abandoning mercy entirely. In the end, what Japanese soldiers hated about facing Marines was that Marines represented everything Japanese military ideology denied could exist. It was impossible, according to Bushido. Principles for soft democratic people to fight as effectively as warriors trained in hardship and willing to die. It was impossible for material abundance to overcome spiritual purity. It was impossible for an enemy to be both tactically superior and morally restrained. But Marines were all these things because they were products of a different system, democratic rather than authoritarian, industrial rather than agrarian, pragmatic rather than ideological. They fought not for an emperor deity, but for each other, and for a society they genuinely wanted to return to. They endured hardship not as spiritual purification, but as temporary condition on the road to victory. They killed efficiently without hatred, and won completely without requiring the total annihilation of their enemy. The hatred Japanese soldiers felt was ultimately not for individual Marines, but for what Marines represented. The revelation that everything Japanese military culture taught about war, sacrifice, and spirit was insufficient against an enemy that combined material superiority with equal determination. That realization, more than any battlefield defeat, was the true victory American forces achieved. They did not merely defeat Japanese military forces, they invalidated the entire ideological framework that made Japanese military aggression possible. And they did so not through propaganda or persuasion, but through systematic demonstration that there was another way to organize society, another way to fight wars, another way to treat both allies and enemies, and that way was superior. The jungle on Guadalcanal still breathes with humid intensity. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima still lies undisturbed in places, mixed with the bones of men from both sides who died there. The caves of Paleliu still tunnel through coral rock. These places remember, in their geology and vegetation, what happened when two incompatible military philosophies collided and one proved insufficient. The lesson was written in blood across thousands of Pacific miles, that in modern industrial war, courage alone cannot win. Material, logistics, tactics, training, and the ability to adapt and learn matter equally. And perhaps most importantly, that soldiers who fight for a society they want to return to, supported by that society's full productive capacity, will eventually overcome soldiers who fight only to die gloriously in service to ideology that offers nothing but sacrifice. That was the lesson Japanese soldiers learned facing Marines. It was a lesson taught in fire and blood at terrible cost to both sides, but it was learned. And in learning it, Japanese military culture, centuries old, steeped in tradition, proud of its warrior heritage, discovered it was fundamentally inadequate for the modern world. The hatred Japanese soldiers felt toward Marines was the hatred of men watching their entire belief system crumble under the weight of empirical reality. It was deserved because what they fought for, empire built on conquest and racial superiority, deserved to be destroyed. But it was also human, because no one enjoys the revelation that everything they believed, everything they sacrificed for, everything they were taught was honorable and true, was in fact insufficient and doomed from the beginning. Marines did not merely defeat Japanese forces in the Pacific. They demonstrated through systematic victory across 3 years of savage combat that there were truths more powerful than fighting spirit, virtues more valuable than willingness to die, and systems of organization superior to authoritarian militarism. That demonstration, more than the atomic bombs, more than the burned cities, more than the sunken fleet, was what truly defeated Imperial Japan. The hatred Japanese soldiers felt facing Marines was the hatred of witnessing that demonstration, engagement after engagement, island after island, until the lesson could no longer be denied or explained away. The Pacific War ended not when Japan's cities burned, but when Japanese soldiers could no longer believe the lies they had been told. Marines, through sheer professional competence backed by American abundance, forced that realization into being. It was their true victory, more significant than any island captured, more valuable than any battle won. They proved that democracy, for all its messy inefficiency, could produce fighting forces equal to any dictatorship's warriors. They proved that free people, fighting for a society they valued, were as determined as conscripts dying for an emperor. They proved that material abundance, rather than making soldiers soft, provided the foundation for sustained military effectiveness. And they proved all this not through propaganda, but through victory after victory, paid for in blood, but secured through systematic superiority in every dimension of modern warfare. That was why Japanese soldiers hated facing Marines above all others, because Marines were living proof that everything Japanese military culture taught was fundamentally wrong. And that realization, once understood, could never be denied again.